The rain came down in sheets across the cracked asphalt of Route 9, turning the parking lot of the Rusty Nail Bar Grill into a shallow, shivering lake that reflected the neon signs in wobbling streaks of red and amber. Dylan spat a mouthful of blood onto the linoleum floor and felt the jagged edge of something broken shift inside his chest, a sensation so specific and so wrong that his vision went white for 3 full seconds. He was on his knees. Behind him, the thin plywood door of the storage room shuddered against his spine. On the other side of that door, a woman he had never met before tonight was pressing both palms flat against the wood, and he could hear her breathing, fast, terrified, controlled, the breathing of someone who was fighting every instinct to scream. 8 months along. He had noticed that immediately when she walked in out of the storm, the careful way she moved, one hand always drifting toward her abdomen like a compass needle finding north. He was not going to let them through this door. Kid. Sheriff Dale Brody crouched down in front of him, close enough that Dylan could smell the coffee and cruelty on his breath. The man's badge caught the dim fluorescent light and threw a pale coin of reflection across the blood-wet floor. He pressed the muzzle of his service pistol gently, almost tenderly, against the center of Dylan's forehead. Assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted robbery. Resisting arrest. That's federal time, boy. You'll be gray and toothless before you ever see sunlight again. Dylan looked up at him. One eye was swelling shut. His lower lip was split clean through. He thought, distantly, that he should be terrified. He wasn't. Go ahead, he said. His voice was ruined, barely above a whisper, but every word was clear. Arrest me. I'm not moving. The sheriff's smile was the coldest thing in the room. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt. And then, somewhere out in the drowning dark of the Nevada night, the thunder changed. It deepened. It multiplied. It took on a rhythm that thunder simply does not have, a mechanical, furious, ground-shaking cadence that rolled in from the highway like a freight train arriving 16 years early and filled with something enormous and angry. The neon Budweiser sign above the bar began to flicker. The glasses behind the counter trembled against each other with a delicate, terrified ringing. Sheriff Brody turned his head toward the front of the bar. Every set of headlights hit at once. The plate glass window of the Rusty Nail, 7 feet wide, custom-fitted, the pride of old Pop Henderson who had saved 3 months to replace the last one, exploded inward as the front wheel of a blacked-out Harley-Davidson Road King punched through it like a fist through paper. Glass filled the air in a brief, gorgeous constellation. The bike skidded to a stop in the center of the barroom floor, its engine howling, its rider already dismounting before it had fully stopped moving. Behind it came the others. Dylan, through the one eye that still worked properly, watched Sheriff Dale Brody, a man he had personally watched bully a 14-year-old kid for talking back, a man who had never in his professional life taken a step backward from anyone. Go the color of old milk. The man who walked through the broken frame of the front door was not quite human in the way that mountains are not quite landscapes. He was simply too large, too deliberate, too absent of anything resembling uncertainty. 2 meters of muscle and scar tissue and black ink, wearing a leather cut that bore a name Dylan recognized from news articles and whispered conversations in gas stations all across the American Southwest. Hell's Angels. President. Nevada chapter. He stepped over the shattered glass as if it were nothing. As if he walked through broken things every day and had simply stopped noticing. His eyes swept the room once, cataloged everything in the span of a single breath, and then found Dylan. And Dylan, bleeding, broken, barely conscious, pressed against a storage room door with a handcuff halfway around his wrist, understood, in the slow and sideways way that shock allows understanding, that he had spent the last 40 minutes protecting the wrong woman to pick a fight over. He tried to say something. The room tilted. He went down into the dark. Calvert was not the kind of town that appeared on maps you'd buy at a gas station. It was the kind of town that appeared on maps that utility companies kept in filing cabinets, the kind that existed purely to note where the nearest electrical grid extended before giving up. Population 2,400, most of whom had been here long enough that their families appeared on the original deeds, and a rotating cast of strays who drifted in off the highway with flat tires and stayed, because leaving required a kind of momentum that Calvert had a gift for draining right out of people. Dylan Mercer had arrived 18 months ago with a backpack, $43, and a bruise along his left cheekbone that was still yellow at the edges. He was 15 then. He was 17 now. In the mathematics of Calvert, Nevada, that practically made him a local. He slept in a decommissioned Airstream trailer parked behind the Rusty Nail, a courtesy that old Pop Henderson, 65, bourbon-soaked, soft-hearted in the way that men become after decades of watching people come and go, had extended without ever making Dylan ask for it directly. Pop had a gift for solving problems quietly, the way good men often do when they're too tired to deal with the complications of being openly generous. "You can stay out back," Pop had said that first night, not looking up from the glass he was polishing. "Trailer's got a space heater that works maybe 60% of the time. Don't touch my collection." He had gestured at the wall of signed baseball cards behind the bar. "And I could use someone to bus tables and wash dishes 3 nights a week. $10 an hour, cash, no paperwork." Dylan had said, okay. That was the whole negotiation. He learned the rhythms of the Nail quickly. The early evening crowd was mostly working men, ranch hands, mechanics from the auto shop on 5th, the occasional long-haul trucker who needed something stronger than coffee before the next leg of their run. They were rough men, mostly, but honest rough in the way that calloused hands are honest. They tipped in crumpled singles and didn't look at Dylan too hard, and he was grateful for that. The late crowd was different. The late crowd, 3 or 4 nights a week, was Kyle Brody and whatever collection of satellite orbiting him at the moment. Kyle was 19, built like a fire hydrant, and possessed of the particular combination of low intelligence and high social protection that produces the worst kind of bully, one who has never once in his life experienced a consequence. His father ran the Calvert County Sheriff's Department with the easy, absolute authority of a man who understood that in a town this size, in a county with no outside oversight, the law was whatever he said it was. Dylan had watched Kyle pour a full beer over the head of a waitress named Cara for not laughing at one of his jokes. He had watched him corner the dishwasher, a quiet Mexican-American man named Felix, and make him stand against the wall for 10 minutes while Kyle leaned in and told him, very softly, all the things he could arrange to happen. Felix had quit the next day. Dylan had wanted to say something, both times. He hadn't. He was smart enough to know that 17, alone, and undocumented was not a position from which you could afford to make enemies who had police departments behind them. He filed the anger away in the place where he kept all the other anger, the long-running inventory of injustices he had catalogued since he was old enough to understand what injustice was, and he bussed the tables and washed the glasses and waited. At night, in the Airstream, he read whatever paperbacks Pop had discarded in the recycling and watched the desert stars through the screen window and listened to the coyotes out on the flats and tried not to think too hard about the future, because the future was a subject that had never done him any particular good. The one luxury he allowed himself was the dogs. There were 3 of them, a matted shepherd mix he called Boots, an ancient beagle without much enthusiasm left for the world, and a young black and white mutt who had arrived one morning with a broken paw and declined to leave after it healed. Dylan had set the paw himself with a strip of cardboard and some electrical tape, which was how he knew the little dog would stay. Animals, in his experience, remembered who had hurt them and who had helped, and they organized their loyalties accordingly. Every night after his shift, he scraped the kitchen scraps into a bowl and sat with them in the dark behind the trailer while the desert cooled around him. They leaned against his legs and he scratched their ears and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because they didn't need him to say anything. On the night of October 14th, a Wednesday, the coyotes were louder than usual. Dylan lay on his back in the narrow bunk and listened to them and thought about nothing in particular. The sky through the screen window was the deep black of a sky that has swallowed all its stars under a ceiling of clouds, and the first fat drops of rain were just beginning to sound against the aluminum skin of the trailer. He fell asleep to the smell of rain on hot asphalt. He didn't know yet what the storm was bringing in. The storm announced itself properly around 9 o'clock, when the radar on Pop's old television in the corner showed a mass of red and purple sweeping up from the south like a bruise spreading across the state. In 20 years of operating a bar in Calvert, Pop had learned to read a storm the way a ship's captain reads the sea, with respect, with wariness, and with the understanding that what it wanted from you ultimately didn't matter. "Going to be a bad one," he said, to no one in particular. Dylan was restocking the beer cooler behind the bar and didn't answer. He had learned that Pop's weather observations were rarely actually about the weather. By 10, the storm had arrived in full. The rain came down not in drops, but in curtains, slamming against the pavement and the corrugated metal roof of the nail with a sound like sustained applause. The highway outside had gone from a trickle of late-night traffic to nothing. Lightning moved somewhere out on the flats, not the sharp, isolated bolts of a summer storm, but the long, branching sheets that lit the whole sky at once and turned the desert momentarily pale and enormous. Most of the regulars had gone home early, reading the sky correctly. The bar had emptied down to a pair of ranch hands nursing their last drinks at the far end of the counter and Felix's replacement, a man Dylan only knew as Torres, who was technically done with his shift, but drinking quietly rather than driving in this weather. Pop was behind the bar, running inventory with the focused expression of a man who uses numbers to avoid thinking. Dylan was wiping down tables when the door opened. She came in with the rain, pushing against the wind with both hands on the door, and the contrast was so immediate and so complete that Dylan stopped what he was doing without meaning to. The woman was somewhere in her late 20s, dark-haired, wearing a light-colored jacket that the rain had darkened across the shoulders and along the sleeves. She was beautiful in the way that very tired, very competent people sometimes are, with a quality of presence that had nothing to do with circumstance. And she was, unmistakably, heavily pregnant. 8 months at least, Dylan estimated, though he had no particular frame of reference for this beyond instinct. The way she moved told the whole story, careful, balanced, one hand perpetually near the curve of her abdomen as she closed the door behind her and stood for a moment just breathing in the relative warmth of the bar. She looked at the room, took it in, decided it was safe enough. "Can I sit anywhere?" she asked. Her voice was calm. "Anywhere you like," Pop said, already reaching for the coffee pot. Some things about Pop were absolutely automatic. She chose a booth by the side wall, not the window, Dylan noticed. Smart. She settled in with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to make any chair comfortable, and she pulled out a phone and frowned at it in the way that people frown when they already know what the phone is going to tell them. No signal, probably, or a dead battery. She set it face down on the table. Dylan brought her a menu and a glass of water without being asked. She looked up at him and smiled. The smile reached her eyes completely, which was something Dylan had learned to look for, because people who smiled with only their mouths were telling you something important about themselves whether they meant to or not. "Thank you," she said. "My car broke down about a half-mile up the highway. I'm waiting for my husband to call." A brief pause. "Or for the rain to stop. Whichever comes first." "The rain's supposed to go until morning," Dylan told her. "The coffee's good, though." "Coffee sounds perfect." He brought it. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out at the storm, and Dylan went back to his tables, and the bar settled into the specific quiet of a place riding out weather, the rain loud on the roof, the television muttering about the storm system moving north, the two ranch hands exchanging the slow, economical conversation of men who've worked together long enough that they've said most things already. Dylan was collecting glasses from a table near the door when he heard the vehicles pull up. 3 trucks, from the sound of it. Loud engines, lots of bass from the stereos even in the rain. He knew the sound. He'd been hearing it, with a specific sinking feeling, for 18 months. The door opened with the particular violence of men who don't bother to consider doors as having any function beyond their own passage, and Kyle Brody came in sideways, laughing at something one of the 2 men behind him had said. Already carrying a bottle of beer from somewhere else, he'd been drinking for a while, that much was clear from the gloss in his eyes and the looseness in his movements, the slight overshoot in every gesture. There were 4 of them altogether. Kyle and 3 of his usual orbit, a wide, flat-faced kid named Garrett who was Kyle's age, a couple of older men in their mid-20s who had the look of people who had been following someone else's lead since middle school and had lost the ability to stop. Dylan pulled back toward the bar and kept moving. Invisible was the goal. He had gotten good at invisible. Kyle dropped into a booth near the center of the room, loud and sprawling, already signaling for pop with the kind of entitlement that never acknowledges that it is entitlement. And then his eyes drifted, the way drunk eyes always do, scanning the room for novelty, for something to fix on. They found the woman in the corner booth. Dylan watched it happen. Kyle's posture changed. Straightened slightly. The grin shifted from broad and unfocused to something narrower and more deliberate. He said something to Garrett in a low voice. Garrett looked, and then looked back with an expression that suggested he was both aware this was a bad idea and constitutionally incapable of stopping it. The woman had her eyes down, focused on her phone again, or pretending to. Dylan couldn't tell which. He put the glasses down behind the bar as quietly as he could, and he positioned himself closer to the kitchen pass-through, and he watched. "Hey!" Kyle raised his voice across the room. "You by yourself over there?" The woman didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression was politely neutral in the specific way that women who have been managing situations like this since they were teenagers develop, an expression that says, "I see you, I am not afraid of you, and I am hoping you will make a better choice." "I'm waiting for my husband," she said. Calm. Clear. "Yeah." Kyle pushed himself out of his booth. "He doesn't sound like he's in a hurry." Dylan looked at Pop. Pop was looking at the phone behind the bar, the landline, the one he used to call and supply orders. His hand was on it. His face had gone a shade of gray that Dylan recognized, the color of a man who knows what is right and is calculating, in real time, whether he has enough left to do it. The two ranch hands at the end of the bar had gone very still. Torres had found something interesting to study in his drink. Dylan felt the anger rising up through the floor of his chest, or maybe that was just the familiar sick feeling that came from watching the same thing happen again and again and doing nothing about it, because doing nothing was the only rational option available to someone in his position. He was 17. He was a nobody. He was one phone call away from a vagrancy charge and a juvenile facility in a system that had already demonstrated, thoroughly and repeatedly, what it thought of people like him. Kyle slid into the booth across from the woman. She moved the mug of coffee between her hands and looked at him with the same careful neutrality and said something Dylan couldn't hear, and Kyle laughed. Dylan's hand found the back of a nearby chair. He stood there and waited. It happened quickly, the way everything ugly happens quickly. Kyle reached across the table and put his hand on the woman's wrist. She pulled back. He followed, his grip tightening. Dylan could see the whitening of her knuckles from 15 feet away. And then Kyle's other hand moved toward the curve of her belly, not touching yet, just hovering, which was somehow worse, and the woman's face changed. The careful neutrality fell away, and what replaced it was not fear but fury, which Dylan somehow hadn't expected, and which he found, in some sideways part of his mind, completely correct. She said, clearly and loudly, "Do not touch me." Kyle laughed again. Somewhere behind the bar, Pop had the phone to his ear. Dylan could hear him speaking quietly. "Sheriff's Department." Even as he watched, Dylan knew what would happen. The department would ask who was causing trouble, Pop would say Kyle Brody, and the dispatcher would pause. In the specific way that dispatchers pause when they are calculating what information to pass along and what to simply file under call not received. Nobody was coming. Nobody ever came. The chair was already in Dylan's hand. He had picked it up without deciding to, or rather, he had decided in the place that was below decision, the place that had been watching and recording and filing everything away for 17 years, the place that had run out of room. He crossed the floor in 4 steps. The chair connected with Kyle Brody's upper back with a crack that cut through the rain noise and the television and the low hum of the beer coolers and filled the entire bar for one clear, ringing second. Kyle went face first into the table. The coffee mug tipped and shattered. Dylan was already moving. He grabbed the woman's hand, "Come on, come on, come on," and pulled her toward the kitchen. She moved fast for someone 8 months along. She had clearly decided, in the same place Dylan had, that the time for deliberate choices was over. Behind them, Kyle was making noise. The other three were getting up. Pop was pressed against the back wall, the phone still in his hand, doing the math and coming up empty. Dylan hit the kitchen door with his shoulder and pulled Elena through. The kitchen was all stainless steel and fluorescent light, and the smell of old grease and dish soap. Dylan pulled her past the prep stations and the walk-in cooler and down the short hallway at the back, toward the storage room, a heavy door with a deadbolt, concrete walls, no windows. He had inventoried this room 100 times, restocking bottles and dry goods, and he had always noted, in the unconscious way that people who have spent their lives in uncertain situations note exits and safe places, that it was the most defensible space in the building. The kitchen door crashed open behind them. Dylan pulled her into the storage room and said, "Get in the back. Stay down. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" She grabbed his arm. Her grip was incredibly strong. "You're a child," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not an accusation, but something more complex, a recognition, maybe, of something she hadn't expected to find in a bar in the middle of Nevada at 10:30 on a Wednesday night. "I'm fine," Dylan said. "Don't come out." She looked at him for one long second. Her eyes were dark brown and absolutely direct. Then she let go of his arm, nodded once, and moved back into the stacks of bottles and boxes. Dylan stepped back out of the storage room, pulled the door shut, and locked it with the deadbolt. Then he swallowed the key. It tasted like iron and the specific, irrevocable sensation of having made a decision that closed all the other doors. He turned around and faced the hallway. They came around the corner 30 seconds later, Kyle first, Garrett right behind him, the other two filling the width of the corridor. Kyle's nose was bleeding from the table impact and his eyes had gone flat and bright in the way that drunk and angry eyes do, all the social filters burned away to something simpler and considerably more dangerous. "Where is she?" Kyle said. Dylan stood in front of the storage room door with his arms at his sides. "Gone," he said. "Back entrance." Kyle looked at him for a moment, evaluating this claim, and then looked at the door directly behind Dylan, and then looked back at Dylan, and understood, at whatever depth of comprehension was still available to him, what was actually happening. His expression shifted into something that might have been respect, had it occurred in any other context. Instead, it just looked like what it was. "You stupid little punk," Kyle said. "Yeah," Dylan said. The first punch took him in the side of the head, rocking him back against the door. He grabbed the door frame to keep himself upright. The second caught him in the ribs left side, the crack of it immediately distinct from muscle impact, that specific, private wrongness that said this is structural damage, pay attention. And his vision went gray and he slid sideways and caught himself on his hands and knees. He got back up. He wasn't a fighter. He knew this about himself with perfect clarity. He was 5'10" and 140 pounds of mostly hollow spaces, and he had no training in anything and no particular natural ability in this domain, and genuinely no realistic assessment of his odds. He got back up anyway, because the alternative was to fall forward and leave the door exposed, and the door was the only thing that mattered. He grabbed Kyle's collar and pulled him sideways, managing to get in one good head, but that surprised both of them, and then Garrett hit him from behind with something he couldn't identify, a bottle, maybe, from the sound of it. And the world rang like a struck bell, and he went down properly this time, to his hands and knees on the kitchen tile, the floor cold and wet beneath his palms. He thought about the woman in the storage room. He thought about the baby inside her. He thought about the matter-of-fact way she had looked at him, right before she'd gone inside, like she was memorizing something. He didn't fall forward. He turned himself around so that his back was against the door, and he sat against it, and he wrapped both arms around Kyle's left ankle when Kyle tried to step over him, and he held on. "Get off," Kyle said, and kicked him, and he held on. He couldn't feel his left hand properly anymore. Something was wrong with the ribs on his left side that was getting progressively more wrong, a deepening wrongness, each breath a negotiation. His face was wet with blood and with rain that was coming through the back screen door at the end of the hallway. He held on. He thought about Boots and the beagle and the little black and white mutt with the repaired paw. He thought about the way the stars looked from the Airstream window on a clear night, the desert spread out in every direction, enormous and indifferent and somehow, in its very indifference, honest. He held on. Behind the door, faint but clear, he heard a woman's voice, steady, quiet, murmuring something he couldn't make out, something that sounded like she was talking to the baby. He held on. Sheriff Dale Brody arrived at 11:22, by which time the beating had run its natural course and Kyle had retreated to the bar front with his associates, satisfied in the specific way that certain types of violence leave certain types of people satisfied. Dylan had been left in the kitchen corridor, which was where Pop found him, still sitting upright against the storage room door, which none of them had managed to open, the key having gone somewhere they couldn't reach. Pop had tried to help him up. Dylan had shaken his head. "I'm fine here," he'd said, which was not true in any meaningful sense, but was true in the sense that he intended it. He wasn't moving. Pop had gone back to the bar looking like he'd aged 10 years in an hour, and Dylan had stayed where he was, listening to the rain and to his own breathing and to the occasional sound from behind the door. The sheriff came in through the front, in uniform, with 2 deputies and a look on his face that Dylan recognized from the way teachers look when they've been interrupted during their planning period, the specific, proportional irritation of someone whose time has been wasted. He spoke briefly with Kyle, touching his son's shoulder, looking at the blood on Kyle's face with an expression that would have been paternal concern in a different kind of man, and here was something colder and more proprietary. Then Pop said something. Dylan couldn't hear it from the hallway, but he could hear the tone of it, careful, apologetic, the tone Pop always used with authority figures, the tone of a man who had learned over decades that surviving required a particular posture. The sheriff's voice came back, louder and flatter. Then footsteps. Brody appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was 50 years old, built like a man who had been athletic 30 years ago and hadn't fully forgiven his body for what had happened since. He wore his authority like a second uniform, not in the badge or the gun, but in the way he occupied space, the assumption of deference baked into every movement. He looked at Dylan against the wall. He looked at the storage room door. He looked back at Dylan. "You assaulted my son," he said. "Your son grabbed a pregnant woman," Dylan said. His voice sounded strange to him, distant and very calm, the way voices get when the body has other priorities. "I stopped him. That's not what my son says. Your son is drunk." Brody's eyes went flat in a way that Kyle's had gone flat earlier, but differently, where Kyle's had been the flatness of someone who had stopped thinking, Brody's was the flatness of someone who had done a great deal of thinking and arrived somewhere particular. He took a step into the hallway. "Son," he said, "I don't know who you are or where you came from. What I do know is that I've got 4 witnesses who saw you attack my boy with a bar stool, assault 2 of my county residents, and barricade a woman against her will in that storage room. That's assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful imprisonment, and attempted robbery. You're looking at felony charges." Dylan said, "There's a pregnant woman in that room." "Then open the door." "No." The sheriff looked at him for a long moment, doing the same math that Dylan was doing, and arriving at the same conclusion that people with all the power always arrived at in these situations, that the math was entirely in his favor. He reached for his gun. Not to fire it, they both understood that. To establish something. The gun came out and was pressed, with an almost gentle firmness, against Dylan's forehead. The metal was cold and smelled of machine oil and the years of accumulated threat that a weapon accumulates simply by existing in a position of authority. "Open the door," Brody said, "or I will book you tonight and lose the paperwork for a week." Dylan thought about the key in his stomach. "I can't open it," he said. The handcuffs came off Brody's belt. And from somewhere outside, the thunder changed. The sound reached them before the light did. It started as a vibration in the concrete floor, subtle, at the edge of perception, the kind of thing you might dismiss as a truck on the highway or a fault in the building's foundation. Then it became audible, a low and rolling frequency that climbed steadily in pitch and volume and complexity, multiplying as it climbed, dozens of voices joining the same note until it was not a sound so much as a weather system of its own. The neon signs on the front wall began to stutter. Dylan heard someone in the bar say, "What the?" and then the sentence went nowhere. The lights hit through the cracked windows, white and brilliant, dozens of them, catching the rain and turning it into something theatrical, a moving curtain of light and water. And underneath the sound now was something physical, something you felt in your sternum and your back teeth, the kind of deep cycle vibration that large engines at close range produce, the kind that human bodies respond to below the level of thought. Brody turned his head. The handcuff had made it around Dylan's right wrist. His left was still free. Every lamp in the rusty nail flickered and went out for 1 second, 2 seconds, and in the darkness the headlights through the window were absolute. The front window detonated. That was the only word for it. Not broke, not shattered, detonated. In a single explosive instant, the tempered glass dissolving into 1,000 pieces that caught the headlights as they fell and turned briefly into something almost beautiful before they hit the floor in a sound like the world's most violent applause. The bike that came through drove a groove in the shards and stopped, and its rider was off it before the engine cut, moving toward the bar with the particular economy of someone for whom violence is not an emergency but a function. They came through behind the first one in a river, 20, 30, more, some through the destroyed window frame, some through the front door which had been removed from its hinges by the simple application of a truck bumper. The leather cuts were everywhere, black and heavy with patches, and every face in the bar that had been associated with Kyle Brody in the last 2 hours went from pink to white in the span of a single collective breath. The deputies' hands went to their guns. "I wouldn't," said a voice from somewhere in the crowd of bikers. The deputies did not. Kyle made a sound that Dylan, even from the kitchen hallway, identified as the sound of someone encountering, for the very first time, a force of nature large enough to make the coordinates of his social position entirely meaningless. Brody was still in the hallway with Dylan. He was very still. He had taken the gun from Dylan's forehead when the window came in, and he was holding it pointed at the floor. And he was listening to the sounds from the bar with the expression of a man performing a rapid revaluation of every assumption he had entered the building with. Then the footsteps came through the kitchen, steady, unhurried, in no particular hurry, because unhurried was the natural state of something that didn't have to be in a hurry. And Marcus Reaper Vance stepped around the corner and filled the kitchen doorway and looked at his wife's blood on the floor, and at the storage room door behind Dylan, and at the handcuff around Dylan's wrist. He looked at all of this very carefully. And then he looked at Sheriff Dale Brody. Perspective shift, Marcus Reaper Vance. He had not been afraid in so long that fear had become theoretical for him, a word he understood the meaning of without having access to the sensation it described. He had been in rooms with men who wanted to kill him, had sat across tables from people who had every resource and intention necessary to end his life, and none of it had done what was happening to him right now, standing in this kitchen doorway, looking at the bloody floor and the locked door and the kid propped against it. The kid was 17, maybe, and he had the specific kind of hollow face that people get when they've been consistently underfed for an extended period, not starved, but not enough, never quite enough. He was wearing a bar apron with someone else's name tag pinned to it, and he had been beaten methodically enough that one side of his face was unrecognizable, and his left hand was at a wrong angle at the wrist, and the way he was breathing told Reaper, who had seen enough of both, that he had at least 2 broken ribs and possibly a lung issue developing. And his back was against the storage room door. He had been beaten unconscious, and he was still against the storage room door. Reaper had built his entire adult life on a very simple principle, that the only currency that mattered was loyalty, and that loyalty was a thing you paid full price for or you did not acquire it at all. He had met men who pledged loyalty with words and men who expressed it in action, and he had learned, through 35 years of highly educational experience, that the gap between those 2 categories was where most of the world's suffering occurred. The kid had never met Elena before tonight. He didn't know her name. He had absolutely no reason, in any rational calculation, to put his body between her and the people in this hallway. The fact that he had done it anyway, and had apparently continued doing it past the point where a rational person stops, past the point of broken bones and lost consciousness, past the point where even loyalty would have said you've done enough, stand down, was not something Reaper had language for immediately, because it was not something he encountered in the ordinary run of his life. He would find language for it later. Right now he looked at Sheriff Brody. Brody was a type he recognized, the petty king, the small-town absolute. A man who had never in his career encountered a ceiling because in his world no ceiling existed. Brody was looking back at him with the particular expression of a man who understands, for the first time, that the coordinates of his authority stop at the edge of his territory, and that something has arrived from outside his territory that does not know or care about his coordinates. Put the gun on the floor, Reaper said. His voice was very quiet. It did not need to be loud. In his experience, the quieter you were, the more carefully people listened. Brody's gun went to the floor. The key, Reaper said to one of his men, gesturing at the storage room door. The man produced a tool from his vest, a small pry bar, and stepped past Dylan and went to work on the deadbolt. The door came open. Elena was in the back of the room, seated on a crate, both hands over her abdomen. She looked up when the light came in and saw him, and her expression did something complicated that he was glad no one was watching too closely, because it was not an expression meant for an audience. "I'm all right," she said immediately, before he could say anything. "I'm all right. The baby's all right." He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hands on her face and looked at her, cataloging the way he always cataloged, the way his brain was built, looking for what her words might be covering. She met his gaze directly. She was telling the truth. "There's a boy," she said. "Outside the door." She stopped and started again. He swallowed the key. Reaper looked at the door. He looked at the hallway where the kid had been. He stood up and walked back out. Dylan was only partly conscious by the time they got the door open, which meant he experienced what followed in fragments, sensory impressions without full narrative, like a film with every third frame removed. He was aware of being lifted, carefully, by hands that were large enough to make the action effortless, and of being carried through the kitchen and into the bar, and of the sound of a great many people making room. He was aware of being set down on one of the bar tables, which had been cleared, and of a woman's voice, Elena, he understood, though her face was not in focus, saying something low and specific to whoever was listening. And then he was aware of a different quality of sound from the room, a concentrated silence, the kind that happens when a large group of people all make the same decision to pay attention. And he turned his head and made his eye focus and saw what was happening in the center of the bar. Reaper had Kyle Brody by the collar. Kyle was making sounds. Dylan had heard a lot of sounds in his life, and he cataloged them automatically, and the sound Kyle was making was one he had not personally made, but had heard described in other contexts. The sound of someone who is encountering their own smallness for the first time and discovering it to be bottomless. Reaper said something to Kyle, very quietly, and Kyle nodded, and then it was over for Kyle. In a way that Dylan couldn't see clearly from the table, but that involved one specific motion, and a sound that he would not repeat, and that Kyle Brody would feel for the rest of his life every time he tried to use his hands for anything requiring strength. Then the deputies were moved aside, efficiently, by men who knew how to move people without making it into a discussion, and Reaper walked to Sheriff Brody. Brody was standing in the center of the bar floor. He was 50 years old and had been the law in this county for 22 years, and he was standing in the center of his own jurisdiction, and he was not, despite every instinct and training and experience and institutional backing, able to do anything about what was happening. Reaper crouched down and swept a quantity of broken glass from the shattered front window into a rough pile in the center of the floor, using his boot, in a gesture of absolute deliberate calm that was somehow more unsettling than any amount of shouting. He pointed at the glass. "Kneel," he said. Every person in the room was very still. "You can't," Brody started. Reaper looked at him. Just looked. With the complete and unadorned attention of someone for whom this was a very straightforward situation. Brody looked at his deputies. His deputies looked at the floor. His knees went down into the glass. The sound it produced, the fine, sustained grinding of a man's weight on broken glass, plus the particular catch in Brody's breathing that the pain produced, seemed to Dylan, watching from the table, like the sound of something very old and very wrong finally paying its bill. Look at the boy, Reaper said. Brody's head turned toward the table where Dylan was lying, one eye swollen shut, ribs grinding with each breath, face an impressionist painting in blood and bruise. That boy, Reaper said, put himself between your son and my wife. Your son. A pause. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Brody said nothing. Say it, Reaper said. Say you understand. What happened next was something Dylan would spend a long time thinking about, in the weeks and months that followed, trying to locate its meaning. Brody spoke, words of acknowledgement, of culpability, of whatever approximation of remorse is available to men who have never been required to feel it before, and pressed his forehead to the glass-covered floor, and Dylan watched it, and felt none of the triumph he might have expected. What he felt, instead, was tired. Profoundly, completely, structurally tired, the kind of tired that is not about sleep, but about the number of years you have spent braced against a world that required constant bracing. The exhaustion of 17 years of vigilance finally, in this specific moment, being released. He felt Reaper's jacket settle over him like a weight, heavy leather, warm from the man's body heat, smelling of motor oil and rain and something Dylan could not name but would later associate, whenever he encountered it, with the specific sensation of being covered. And then the dark came up again, gentle this time, and he let it. He came back to consciousness in stages, the way you come back from something deep, first awareness of sensation, warmth, softness, the antiseptic smell that meant hospital, and underneath it something floral that was more ambiguous, then awareness of sound. Machines, somewhere nearby, a steady and reassuring rhythm, rain still, but distant, muffled by walls that were significantly thicker than the airstreams, then, finally, sight. The ceiling was white. Not yellowed or water-stained, not the institutional beige of the county facilities he had been in before. White, clean, with a recessed light fixture. There was a window to his left with curtains that appeared to be made of actual fabric, not plastic blinds, but curtains hung on a rod, with a small design he couldn't make out at this distance. He was in a bed. Not a cot. A bed wide, with a mattress that seemed to be actively cooperating with his body, and sheets that had a thread count he had no reference point for. He turned his head slowly, feeling the inventory of damage, ribs definitely broken, breathing manageable through the pain, something wrapped around his left hand, face less agonizing than it had been, which suggested medication and time. His right arm had a line in it running to a bag on a stand. Elena was in a chair beside the bed. She was wearing different clothes than the night before, soft ones, dark blue, and her hair was down, and she was reading something on a tablet, and she looked, in the morning light coming through the curtained window, like someone who had slept and eaten and made several decisions, and was now proceeding from a place of settled composure. She looked up when he moved, and the smile she gave him was the same one as the night before, all the way to the eyes, but larger now, deeper, with something additional in it that Dylan didn't have immediate vocabulary for. "Good morning," she said. Dylan opened his mouth, and what came out was, "How's the baby?" Elena laughed, a real laugh, surprised, brief, complete. "The baby is perfect," she said. "The baby does not know anything happened." "Good," Dylan said. He meant it with everything he had. She set down the tablet and leaned forward slightly. "How do you feel?" "Like I made some choices," Dylan said. "You made very good choices," Elena said. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The sheriff is currently cooperating with a federal investigation into corruption and misconduct covering approximately 9 years of his tenure," Elena said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reading a weather forecast. "The particulars are being handled. Kyle Brody. Kyle will not be causing problems for anyone for some time." A brief pause. "His hands will heal eventually. Mostly." Dylan processed this. "The bar. Old Pop. Pop Henderson is fine. The damage to the rusty nail is being repaired. Pop has been offered enough money to retire if he chooses, which apparently he does not, but he seemed pleased by the offer." "You talked to him?" "Marcus did. She said the name in a specific way, the way you say a name that means a great many things. He spent the first few hours of this morning making phone calls. As if on cue, or because he'd been informed, which was more likely, the door opened. Marcus Reaper Vance walked into the room, which he filled to approximately 60% capacity by himself. He was not wearing his cut. He had on a black shirt and dark jeans, and without the iconography of the patch, he was simply a very large man with very thorough tattoos and eyes that were doing exactly what they'd been doing last night, cataloging, evaluating, thinking several moves ahead. He looked at Dylan for a long moment, standing in the doorway. Dylan looked back. "You swallowed the key," Reaper said. It was not phrased as a question, but Dylan answered it anyway. It seemed like the best option at the time. Reaper considered this. "It was," he said. He moved a chair next to the bed and sat in it, which required the chair to make a structural commitment, and he leaned his forearms on his knees and looked at Dylan with direct attention. "I need to know some things," he said. "Okay," Dylan said. "How old are you?" 17. "You have family?" "No." "How long have you been in Calvert?" 18 months. Reaper nodded slowly. "Before Calvert?" Dylan thought about this. About the 12-year-old sleeping under an overpass in Phoenix, about the group home in Tucson that had taught him, definitively, that institutional care was a category error. About the years in between filled with a succession of arrangements that had in common only their provisional nature. "Around," he said. Reaper was quiet for a moment. Then, "The men in my organization. You know who we are." It was not a question. "Yes," Dylan said. "And you know what that means. What we do. The kind of people we are." "Yes." Reaper leaned back slightly. "And you don't have a problem with that." Dylan thought about it honestly. "I've never had the luxury of having principles about who protects me," he said. "Or who I protect. I saw what was happening, and it was wrong. That's all it was." Reaper looked at him for a long time. Elena had her eyes on Dylan with an expression he still didn't quite have language for recognition, maybe, of something she understood and had been waiting to see confirmed. "All right," Reaper said. That was all he said. But in the way he said it, Dylan heard the weight of what it meant, the all right of a man for whom words were expensive and therefore precisely priced. He looked at Elena. Elena was smiling. "Sleep," she said. "You need at least 3 more days before you're going to feel anything like a person." Dylan slept. Outside the window, in the washed clear morning after the storm, the Nevada sky was an absolutely uncomplicated blue, the kind that only appears after a great deal of weather has been cleared away. The baby came on a Tuesday in January, during a cold snap that brought frost to the valley floor for the first time in 6 years. Her name was Lucia, and she arrived into the world with the calm, unhurried presence of someone who had been given enough time to decide she was ready, and who intended to remain. Dylan was not in the delivery room. That was between Marcus and Elena in the specific way that certain things are, but he was in the waiting room of the private clinic, wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, which were significantly nicer than anything he'd owned 3 months ago. And he was not reading any of the magazines on the table because he was unable to think about anything other than the fact that this was happening and that it mattered to him in a way he had not anticipated and had not prepared for. At 3:17 in the morning, Marcus came out and found him. The man looked different. Dylan had spent 3 months getting to know Marcus Reaper Vance, and he had learned to read the landscape of the man's expression with some accuracy, which was an education in itself. He had seen him conduct business meetings across a table from men who were actively afraid of him while eating a sandwich, apparently indifferent. He had seen him deal with situations that required considerable force with the same flat composure he brought to every other activity. He had seen him with Elena, which was different, a whole architecture of protection and tenderness that existed in the small calibrations of where his hands were and which direction his attention went when she walked into a room. Now he looked like he had been taken apart and put back together by something that didn't have to ask permission. He sat down in the plastic waiting room chair next to Dylan without preamble. They sat in silence for about 30 seconds. 8 pounds, 4 ounces, Reaper said. She has Elena's eyes. Dylan said, "That's good." "Yes," Reaper said. "It is." Another pause. "Elena wants to see you," Reaper said. Dylan followed him down the corridor to the room and through the door, and Elena was in the bed, tired and utterly luminous in the way that new mothers have been luminous since there were people to observe it. And in her arms was a small bundle that appeared to be sleeping with considerable confidence in its own safety. Dylan stood at the foot of the bed. Elena looked at him. "Come closer," she said. "She won't break." He came closer. The baby Lucia, 7 hours old, was the most complete thing Dylan had ever seen. She had the absolute simplicity of something that has not yet learned complexity, a face of total unconcern, eyes moving under their lids toward whatever newborns dream about. "Hi," he said to the baby. He felt slightly ridiculous, and then slightly less ridiculous, and then not ridiculous at all. Elena put her free hand on his. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not the kind of thank you this is." He was quiet. "You gave her," Elena said, 3 extra months to be born into a world where she's going to be safe. 3 months ago, in that hallway, you decided with nothing, with no reason, with no one watching, with everything against you, that she mattered. That is a thing I will not run out of reasons to be grateful for." Dylan had not cried in several years, as a matter of operational practice. He did not cry now. But he sat in the chair by Elena's bed and held her hand and looked at the sleeping baby and felt something in the long-locked inventory of his interior finally, quietly resolve. The compound was outside Reno, set back from the highway on 40 acres of high desert, fenced in a way that was functional rather than decorative. When Reaper had asked, on Dylan's 4th day in the clinic, whether he had anywhere to be, Dylan had said no with such uncomplicated honesty that Reaper had nodded and said, "Then you're staying here for now," with equal straightforwardness. And that was how it had been arranged. For now had become a week, and a week had become a month, and somewhere in the 2nd month it had stopped being a question. He had his own room in the main house, large, with a window facing the desert, with a shelf for books, because Elena had noticed immediately that he read everything he could find and had arranged accordingly. He had been taken to a clinic, a real one, by a doctor who was clearly on excellent terms with the organization, and he had been given proper care for the ribs and the hand and everything else, and then he had been taken somewhere else for what Elena called checking in with a therapist who came to the compound on Thursdays, and who was very good at asking questions that opened doors Dylan had never tried opening before. He had kept the key. Once it had been recovered, in the way such things are eventually recovered, one of the mechanics at the compound had made a chain for it, thin steel, clean-linked, and Dylan wore it around his neck. He didn't explain it to people. He didn't need to. The people at the compound had been told what had happened, and they understood in the way that people who live by codes of loyalty understand, which was completely and without complication. The compound had 32 full-time residents plus the extended family of the chapter, and in the 3 months Dylan had been there, he had cataloged them all with the same accuracy he brought to all environments. There was Cutter, 48, who rebuilt engines with a precision that bordered on the spiritual, who had adopted the practice of bringing Dylan coffee in the morning without comment and had apparently decided this was now his responsibility. There was Mama Jo, a formidable 60-year-old woman who managed the compound's domestic operations and who had decided, based on criteria Dylan couldn't entirely identify, that he was not eating enough and that this was a problem requiring her personal attention. There was, gradually, everybody. The adjustment had been strange and had required recalibration at every level. He was used to being invisible, to occupying space apologetically, to eating quickly and asking for nothing and making himself useful in ways that would be noticed without being conspicuous. The compound operated on different assumptions. The compound assumed that he was there, that his presence was not provisional, that his needs were a matter of collective interest, and it expressed this assumption not through conversation about it, but through the continuous, low-level fact of it. A plate at the table, a name in the rotation for chores, someone always knowing where he was without it feeling like surveillance. It took time. He was patient with himself about the time it took. The day Marcus gave him the jacket was a Saturday in March, cold and clear, the kind of Nevada winter day that has no softness in it, but a tremendous quality of light. There was a gathering at the compound, not a formal ceremony, because the organization did not traffic in ceremony for its own sake, but a natural accumulation of people who were there because they wanted to be. Around a fire in the outdoor pit behind the main garage, Reaper found Dylan at the edge of the group, drinking coffee, watching the fire with the quality of attention he brought to things he was trying to understand. He had something under his arm. Dylan looked at it and recognized it immediately, because he had spent a month in the same room as similar garments and had cataloged them with the instinctive accuracy of his nature. It was a leather cut, black, broken in enough that it would fit a person's shoulders like something that already knew them. He looked up at Reaper. Reaper held it out. "This is not a patch," Reaper said. "You're not a prospect. You're not being recruited." A pause. "This is a different thing. You can wear it or not. You can stay or not. Neither changes what you are to us." Dylan took the jacket. It was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the leather, and everything to do with the fact that it had been made with specific intention and given with complete sincerity, which is not the weight of an object, but the weight of what an object represents. He looked at the back. There was no patch with a chapter name, no rank indicator. There was a single line of text in blocky Gothic script that said, "Protected." He stood there for a moment with it in his hands. Then he put it on. The gathered men and women by the fire made a sound, not quite applause, not quite cheering, but something in the register of collective recognition, the sound of a group of people confirming something they already knew. One of the larger mechanics, a man called Hogg who had arms like structural members and a laugh like a heavy engine, pounded him on the back with genuine enthusiasm, and then looked immediately worried about the ribs. "You good?" he asked, with a comical expression of belated concern. "I'm good," Dylan said, and for once in his life he was saying it in a context where it was entirely true. Elena appeared beside him, Lucia in her arms, 3 months old now, possessed already of strong opinions about when she wanted to eat and who was allowed to hold her, but invariably peaceful in Dylan's presence, which was an observation that nobody made too much of, because it didn't need to be made too much of. "How does it fit?" Elena asked. Dylan rolled his shoulders. The leather settled. The weight of it was correct in a way that was difficult to explain and did not require explanation. "Good," he said. Elena looked at him with the expression he had spent 3 months learning to translate, and he had, with time and effort, arrived at a translation. It was the expression of a person who sees someone clearly, without the distortions of fear or hope or history, and is content with what they see. Across the fire, Marcus met his eyes. The man gave him one nod, small, definite, total. Dylan nodded back. The fire burned, high and clear, against the winter sky. Somewhere in the compound's outer buildings, Boots was sleeping in a dog bed that had been purchased, at some expense, in his specific size, because 3 dogs had arrived with Dylan from Calvert in a truck that Cutter had driven there specifically for the purpose. The beagle was elderly and required a special food that Mama Joe ordered without commentary. The black and white mutt had become the compound's resident property, affiliated with no individual, belonging to everyone. Dylan stood inside the ring of firelight, inside the ring of people who had, through a sequence of events that began with a chair and a locked door and a swallowed key, elected him to their particular and specific kind of family. And he stood there in the leather jacket with one word on the back and watched the fire and felt the key against his sternum and listened to the conversations moving around him like weather. He was 17. He had no history that was legible to any official institution. He had no future that was guaranteed. He had no certainties of any kind, which had been true his entire life and was, he suspected, going to continue to be true. He had this, though. This fire, these people, this jacket, this weight. He had Lucia's hand wrapped around his finger, which she did now, without opening her eyes, with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided, on the full authority of 3 months of data, that this is a safe place to hold on. He had been, most of his life, a person that the world glanced past, a stray dog of a person, surviving on margins, catalogued under no category that mattered to anyone who kept categories. He had understood this about himself not with self-pity, but with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who has had a great deal of time to look at things as they actually are. Things were, now, different. He wasn't sure, yet, what he was. The process of becoming something required time he was only beginning to take. But he was here, and warm, and fed, and seen, and wearing a jacket that said protected in blocky Gothic script, which was, he thought, an unusually honest and complete summary of a situation that had begun with a rainstorm and a woman coming in out of the dark. The smallest things sometimes were the pivots. One chair, one door, one swallowed key, and on the other side of it, all of this. He drank his coffee and watched the fire and let Lucia hold his finger and did not think about the past, because the past was the past, and the fire was here, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars.